Many of you know the old German folktale of Rapunzel and her long golden hair, but no one knows the untold story of Rapunzel and her Tower of Knowledge. On this day in 2021, we will discover the exhilarating folktale of Rapunzel in a new light as we take a scientific and mathematical journey through the mind of a young girl locked in a tower. Okay, let's get to our story of Rapunzel and her Tower of Knowledge. If you recall from your childhood the tale from the Brothers Grimm that once upon a time a man and his wife who was with child were forced to surrender their newborn daughter to what appeared to be a sorceress. The deal was struck because the man, fearful for his wife's life, had scaled the wall to the sorceress's garden to steal an edible flower that his wife craved due to pregnancy. When the sorceress caught him, he thought he heard her say that she'd turn him and his wife into squirrels unless he agreed to surrender their child. In strange irony, the sorceress named the child Rapunzel after the name of the flower the father had taken. The scientific name is actually called Campanula rapunculus, which is sometimes called rampion. From that point on, many of us know that the sorceress stowed Rapunzel away alone in a tower in the forest where she would sing and wait for the sorceress's daily visit. Although the story is true and verified by the Brothers Grimm, other writings, barely legible, found in the Trendelberg Tower helps to complete the story that enriches the magnificent life of Rapunzel exponentially. This is the story I remember. It was told to me by my mother when I was very young and was told to her by her father, which was handed down to him through generations. The story went something like this. Around the late 1500s, a man did live next to a woman who he called a sorceress. But what was not told was that the woman was actually his sister, a woman called Helga. The brother and sister were born to the couple Hermann Leibniz and Emmy von Steuben, two prominent scientists of their time. The two were loving parents and paid particular attention to the growth of their children's minds. They cultivated the brother and sister to be inquisitive and experimental in the world of science and mathematics, and often presented them with books and equipment to help them in the pursuance of knowledge. The brother and sister loved each other very much, and together they would spend hours experimenting in the lab they had created. They were convinced that as a team, they would answer all the riddles of the physical world. One day, while working to solve those riddles, the brother, Hermann Jr., absent-mindedly left out a chemical mixture which his pet squirrel consumed. Although the mixture was not deadly, it did cause a moment of incapacitation where the squirrel fell from a tree and became paralyzed in 2 legs. Although the horrible event was an accident, Hermann never forgave himself, gave up science for life, and left home that was once his laboratory. He grew up, married, and referred to science as sorcery. Over time, he forgot the love he had for his sister and began to recognize her as a sorceress. What he didn't know is that his sister never stopped loving him. He also didn't know that his sister, through weeks of studying chemistry and biology books, healed the squirrel's legs with a small injection into the squirrel's spine. She often started to tell him, but she knew he'd misunderstand. Decades later, by the time Hermann Jr. climbed the wall into the sorceress's garden for his wife, he no longer recognized his sister, who he thought to be a powerful witch. When Helga, his sister/sorceress, caught him sneaking over the wall, she really struggled with how to deal with him. She feared for her brother's health and feared he'd go into shock if she announced they were siblings. So she remained incognito. Her heart, as you might think, hurt, but still having some hope for her niece's future and her attitude towards science, she demanded the child from the couple to raise as her own. She predicted that if she could educate the child to the highest degree in the disciplines of math and science, the family as a whole might become less intimidated by the unknowns of nature. Sharing such things as reason and methods of science as a family in the future could reunite the family as a whole, her included. Now, the day the sister, Helga, was given Rapunzel, she was elated with the idea that one day she would once again have a lab partner, although she was very committed to keeping her relation as Rapunzel's aunt a secret. Rapunzel was to call her Helga. Helga immediately created a room in the top of a tower deep in the forest. Now, calling this a room is an understatement. It was more like a library and a laboratory rolled into one. And at the top of the tower was a spinning turret high above the trees, and the ceiling would open for an uninhibited view of the skies. It was one of the few astronomical observatories of the time. The view of individual heavenly bodies became even more superb when the room was furnished with one of the most modern telescopes that could be found. From day one, Helga began by reading ideas of science to her niece every day and every night. She was excited as to how fast her niece was learning, but knew those advances were inevitable given her bloodline of intelligence. After all, her parents were professors. Recall, Rapunzel's grandparents, her Oma and Opa, were considered two of the top scientists of their day. As she got older, Rapunzel did much of her study independently. She studied mathematics, physics, astronomy, chemistry, geology, and biology. In the laboratory, she did many experiments. As a matter of fact, at 12 years old, she attempted a version of the Miller-Urey experiment long before those scientists were even born. One of her favorite things to do was to open the ceiling in her room and run through thought experiments in her mind. Sometimes she would dream of what it would be like to travel to other planets and moons in the solar system. In particular, the planet Mars, since she knew it was so close. She recalled her naive days when she was just 5 and thought planets were the same as stars. After observing the skies for many years, it became obvious to her that the stars always moved in a consistent pattern, whereas the planets appeared to wander in the sky, hence the meaning of the word planet. Rapunzel truly loved the tower in which she lived. Who wouldn't love a place where your mind grows endlessly? One day, Helga came by and noticed a bunch of rocks at the base of the tower. Helga, a little concerned, asked if someone had a stupid idea of trying to build up rocks to get her out of the tower. Rapunzel laughed at the idiotic idea and answered honestly, telling her aunt about her experiments in gravity. Experiments in gravity similar to another character we may recall. Rapunzel went on to describe another thing she imagined, an equation that was derived from distance as a function of time. This equation essentially gave the velocity. Today, we know that velocity is the first derivative in calculus. Of course, the second derivative is acceleration, and the third and fourth are jerk and jounce. Often, she would come up with cute little sayings to help remember what she had learned. She was often credited with the saying in physics that Ma is the greatest force in your life, representing F equals ma, standing for force equals mass times acceleration. This was actually a little ironic considering she didn't know her mother. Day after day, and all this focus on the workings of the world made her one of the top thinkers in the world. Until one day she was experimenting in the arena of lighter than air. She used hot air as well as helium and other gases from her lab to send relatively heavy objects that were numbered off into the skies of Germany. As many of us have done as kids, she attached notes to these balloons so that the folks that found them may one day report the balloon number that they found and where they found it. From this, she could evaluate her experiment. She was very interested in the distances that each balloon journeyed and which type of gas got it there. One day, a visitor, a young prince who had found one of her balloons, showed up in the woods at the base of Rapunzel's tower. What started off a thoughtful experiment would soon turn into a disaster. When the prince saw Rapunzel and her long, beautiful golden hair, he was instantly smitten.
Wow.
And unfortunately for Rapunzel, the feeling was mutual. Yes, many of us were told by our parents that the Rapunzel story is a story about adults having to realize that at some point children grow up and are ready to fly from the nest. But when you know the whole story, it's really about flying the nest too soon. Additionally, it's about how a prince, although alluring, can stunt the potential mind of a young girl who has not mentally reached her potential and has not grown fully in a social sense. It could be said that an open mind cannot be trapped in the structure of a tower, whereas life in the presence of adult can trap the mind forever. As the story continues, Rapunzel's hair is so long that the prince can use it as a rope. He climbs up to spend time with her. And as you may have heard before, the so-called sorceress, Rapunzel's aunt, finds out the two have been meeting. The aunt, feeling Rapunzel may give up everything, cuts all of Rapunzel's beautiful long hair off, locked her up in another room in attempt to protect her, and placed a ladder leading up to the entrance of the tower window. Behind a curtain at the tower window, Rapunzel's aunt waited patiently for the young prince to appear. When he did appear, he got the fright of his life. The fright was so jolting that he fell from the top of the ladder and into a rose bush, where the thorns from the bush caused him to go blind. Rapunzel's aunt, not knowing he went blind, yelled to the young prince that Rapunzel was sent far away forever. The destitute prince, with his hands outstretched as feelers, began to wander the forest aimlessly, believing he'd never see Rapunzel again. Rapunzel, from the room she was placed in, felt sorry for the prince and wasn't sure what to do. Occasionally, Rapunzel, who was put back in the tower, would hear at night, in the forest, the voice of the prince crying, "I can't see, I can't see." Sad, but then elated, Rapunzel had a brainstorm. About a year ago today, Rapunzel had a pet dog which had lost her eyesight. But with hard work, strong research, and a little luck, she was able to create a concoction in her chemistry laboratory that returned that dog's sight back to normal. She thought to herself, the same concoction would work on the prince. Of course, the one problem was, how was she going to get Helga to agree? She decided to approach Helga with a logical argument rather than an emotional one. This argument, or deal is actually what it was a deal she thought Helga could not refuse. The next day when Helga came to the tower, Rapunzel was ready to negotiate, but Rapunzel could have not been ready for the shock she was going to get that day. She told Helga of the idea that she had thought of in the tower the night before. She knew how important education was to Helga and used that idea for leverage. She told Helga that the prince was very rich, and if Helga would let her go, Rapunzel promised with the riches that she would build a university so large that many minds would expand, not just one. She also promised Helga she would never stop learning. She had already made a contract with herself anyway to be a lifelong learner. She then saw tears leaking from Helga's eyes. These were the tears that would ultimately heal the prince's vision. We'll get back to that point later. Now, Rapunzel had always felt that Helga looked out for her, but this was different. When she thought back, she realized that Helga treated her like family. She treated her with the love of a mother, not just a caretaker. Rapunzel looked into Helga's teary eyes and asked, "Are you my mother?" Helga said, "No, my sweet, beautiful niece. I am your aunt." Instead of being angry for separating her from her parents, Rapunzel, with much instinct, felt sorry for her aunt. She could draw from her aunt's story about how she missed her brother, that Helga, her Aunt Helga, had great anguish and had already suffered enough. Helga then said, "It is time to make everything right." The aunt opened up to Rapunzel about her worries. She confessed her worries that young women can be distracted from doing great things when consumed by the presence of a young man, especially a prince. She cited several cases where she knew women of great intellect resigned their ambitions for knowledge to pursue a dolt dressed in king's clothing. Rapunzel agreed because she recalled a few times when the prince had interfered with some very important experiments she was doing. As Rapunzel was agreeing with her Aunt Helga was energetically agreeing with the idea of building a great university. Together, Rapunzel and her aunt went to her parents to share the idea. With them was Rapunzel's father's pet squirrel. You may ask, how is this so? But if you recall Helga's great scientific abilities, extending the biological life of a pet squirrel is definitely within her strengths. The reuniting of the family, needless to say, was wunderbar. The father, Hermann Jr., with the reunification of his pet squirrel, was reminded of his love for life, love for science, love for his sister, who he knew was not a sorceress now, but most of all, when he saw how his daughter had grown to be such a strong, beautiful woman, he felt his heart grow for his chance to be a family again. With the plan for a great university, Hermann Jr., his wife, Rapunzel, and Helga headed out to the forest to find the prince. As you might have guessed, they found the prince, cured his eyes with the concoction made in the tower, and presented him with the idea of the great university. With his sight back and the beautiful vision of Rapunzel before him, he could not say no. So as one could interpret, it was Rapunzel's aunt's tears of love that allowed the prince to be cured, because without the tears of love, Helga would have never agreed to the overall plan of finding the prince and reuniting the family. As for the great university, it was the pride of the people from miles around. It featured a tower that was used as an observatory, and scientific laboratories were built on every floor. Interestingly, there was a lab that resembled the old lab of Hermann Jr. and Helga, and when you opened the door, you would always see the brother and sister working on a formula as they did as kids. Hundreds of kids graduated every year as prominent scientists, and two of those kids just happened to be the twins of Rapunzel and the prince. As for the tears that cured the prince, many citizens who had ancestors from Rapunzel's time, still maintain that the tears from Rapunzel's aunt cured the prince's vision, but also watered the grounds that sprouted the university itself. That's why at the front gates of the university there is a bronze fountain with a statue of Rapunzel's aunt greeting scholars who enter, as water flows from the corner of the statue's eyes.
Hey, Alien Institute crew! Don't forget to strike the like, subscribe, comment, and share. Also continue learning by watching more AI videos.